In the fall of 2024, a farmland investment fund based in Chicago offered Owen Hetrick $14,000 per acre for the 160-acre northwest quarter of the Hetrick farm in Iroquois County, Illinois. $2,240,000 for a single parcel. Owen had looked at the offer for a while. He had gone to the farm file and found his great-grandfather Frank's 1948 purchase receipt. It was on paper that had yellowed to the color of old cream. The handwriting was the county recorder's, precise and formal, the way official documents were written in 1948. It said, 160 acres, Northwest Quarter, Section 14, Township 27, North Range, 12 West, Iroquois County, Illinois. Purchase price, $6,080, $38 per acre. He had put the receipt on the desk beside the investment fund's offer letter. $38 per acre in 1948, $14,000 per acre in 2024. The same ground, the same 160 acres, the same drummer silty clay loam soil that Frank had paid cash for when the bank would not lend against it because the ground was too wet. The bank that had declined to finance the purchase had closed in 1987. The ground was still in the Hetrick family. Owen had called the investment fund and declined the offer. He had not explained himself at length. He had said, "The ground is not for sale." He put Frank's receipt back in the farm file. Let me tell you about the bank, because the bank's refusal is where the story starts, and the bank's closure is where one thread of it ends. Frank Hetrick had walked into the Watseka First National Bank in September of 1948 with a purchase application for the northwest quarter of Section 14. The wet quarter, as the county knew it, a 160-acre parcel that had been part of a neighboring family's estate and was being sold by the estate executor at $38 per acre. Frank had been farming adjacent ground since 1936. He knew the wet quarter's history. He knew its soil. He had walked every acre of it twice before submitting the application. The loan officer, a man named Whitfield, had reviewed the application. He had looked at the parcel's drainage history. The ground had been poorly drained for its entire recorded agricultural use. It was a wet prairie pothole landscape typical of northeastern Illinois. Flat ground with a clay hardpan at 18 to 24 inches depth that prevented natural drainage, causing water to pond in the low spots after rain and hold there for days or weeks. In wet years, the low acres were underwater in spring and barely recovering by midsummer. In dry years, the same clay hardpan that caused the ponding held moisture, and the ground did better, but not well enough to be reliable. Whitfield had declined the loan. He had said, "Mr. Hetrick, that ground is wet 3 years in 4. It is not worth what the estate is asking." He had said, "We are not able to lend against uncertain ground." Frank had said, "I believe it can be drained." Whitfield had said, "That is a costly proposition, and the outcome is uncertain." He had said the outcome was uncertain twice. He believed this. From a banker's perspective, evaluating a ground parcel based on its current performance rather than its theoretical drained performance, the assessment was defensible. Frank had said, "I understand." He had driven home. He had thought about it for 2 weeks. He had come back to the estate executor, not to the bank, and had offered $38 per acre in cash. $6,080. He had liquidated a portion of his livestock inventory that winter to raise the cash, Selling 12 head of cattle he could not comfortably overwinter, and had closed the purchase in November of 1948. He had not borrowed to buy the wet quarter. He had sold cattle. Now let me tell you what Frank saw when he walked the wet quarter twice in September of 1948, because what he saw is what Whitfield did not see. And the difference between those two visions is the whole story. Whitfield saw current performance, wet ground producing inconsistent crops, a parcel that was risky to lend against because its reliability as collateral depended on drainage improvements that had not been made and whose cost and effectiveness were uncertain. Frank saw the soil. He had pulled a soil probe at 8 locations across the parcel and had dug a test pit in the lowest area to characterize the soil profile. What he found at each location was the same: drummer, silty clay loam from the surface to approximately 18 inches, a beautifully structured dark topsoil with high organic matter, excellent nutrient-holding capacity, and extraordinary water-holding capacity in the zone above the clay hardpan. Below the hardpan, at 18 to 24 inches, the clay layer that was causing the drainage problem. The Drummer Silty Clay Loam Soil Series is among the most productive in the world for corn and soybean production. It develops from prairie vegetation over thousands of years of organic matter accumulation and has a natural fertility that, once the drainage problem is addressed, produces yields that consistently rank among the highest in Illinois. Frank knew this. He had farmed on drummer soils his entire life. He knew what drummer looked like and what it produced when it was drained. The wet quarters problem was the clay hardpan. The clay hardpan solution was tile drainage, perforated clay tiles installed at 18 to 24 inches depth in a systematic grid pattern that intercepted the perched water above the hardpan and carried it to an outlet ditch. Tile drainage was well-established technology in 1948. Frank had tiled other ground. He knew what it cost and how it worked. He estimated the tile drainage system for the wet quarter at approximately $1,200 to $1,500 in 1948 materials and labor. His own labor, which he was not counting as a cash cost. Against the $6,080 purchase price, the total investment in drained ground was approximately $7,500. At the productive capacity of properly drained drummer silty clay loam, which Frank estimated from his experience with adjacent drained drummer ground, the parcel would pay back the total investment in productive value within 10 to 12 years. He had done this calculation on the back of an envelope. He had not showed it to Whitfield. He had bought the ground for cash. The tile drainage installation had taken Frank and his son from 1949 through 1953 to complete. 4 years of hand tiling 1,400 feet of 4-inch clay tile in a herringbone pattern, connecting to a main 6-inch tile outlet at the south field edge. He had installed the tile himself with a tile spade and a tile hook, working 8 to 10 hours per day in the springs of each year when the soil was workable, but the crops were not yet demanding. By 1954, the wet quarter was drained. The spring ponding was gone. The clay hardpan was still there below the tile depth, but the perched water that had been ponding above it was now intercepted and carried to the outlet before it could accumulate. The 1954 corn crop on the wet quarter was 78 bushels per acre. Not exceptional for Illinois in 1954, but solid. and solid on ground that had been producing 30 to 40 bushels in the good years and nothing in the wet ones before the tile was in. By 1965, after 15 years of full drainage and Frank's consistent management, the wet quarter was producing 110 bushels per acre of corn in normal years. It was no longer the wet quarter, except in memory. It was the best ground on the farm. Let me tell you about the 3 generations of Hetricks who have farmed it since Frank bought it in 1948. Because the ground's history is not only Frank's story, it is the story of what each generation did with what Frank started. Frank's son Don had taken over the farm in 1969. The wet quarter by then was fully established as productive ground. Don had expanded the tile system in 1974, adding 800 feet of additional lateral lines to complete the coverage of the field's northwest corner that Frank had not reached in the original installation. He had managed the ground through the farm crisis of the 1980s, when adjacent farmland values collapsed and neighbors were losing ground they had paid top dollar for at the 1981 peak. Don's wet quarter had no land debt against it. Frank had bought it for cash and Don had inherited it the same way, and it had continued producing through the crisis years as if the crisis were someone else's problem, which in financial terms it was. Don had told his son Ray in 1992 when he handed the farm over, "Your great-grandfather paid $38 an acre for this ground when the bank would not lend against it." He had said, "Every acre on this farm came through the crisis without debt because Frank bought what he could pay for without borrowing." He had said, "The bank that laughed at him closed in 1987. Ray had farmed the wet quarter from 1992 to 2018, through the period when Iroquois County corn yields were rising with improved genetics and precision management from 150 bushels per acre in 1992 to 220 bushels and above in good years by 2015. The wet quarter, with its deep, drummer, silty, clay, loam soil fully unlocked by the tile drainage Frank and Don had installed, was producing at or above county averages every year Ray farmed it. Owen had come home to farm in 2018 when Ray's health made it necessary. He had been 32 years old, with 6 years of off-farm work in agricultural technology behind him, and he had come back to a farm that was debt-free and had the same 160-acre wet quarter Frank had bought 70 years earlier as its most productive parcel. He had stood in the wet quarter on the first morning he farmed it alone and had thought about $38 per acre. He had planted his first crop in it that spring. He had pulled 231 bushels per acre of corn from it in the fall. It was the highest yield he had ever seen from a single field in a single season. Let me tell you about the $14,000 offer, because the number is the end of the story's financial arc, and it deserves the full accounting. The Farmland Investment Fund had approached Owen in October of 2024. The fund was buying productive Iroquois County ground as a long-term asset, not to farm it, but to hold it and lease it to a tenant farmer. The $14,000 per acre offer was fair market value for Class 1 Iroquois County farmland in 2024. It was not an exploitative offer. It was the actual price the ground would command in the current market. $2,240,000 for 160 acres, against Frank's $6,080 paid in cash in 1948. The return on Frank's original investment measured only in land value appreciation without counting the 76 years of crop production the ground had generated, was approximately 36,700%. Frank had paid $38 per acre. The ground was offered at $14,000 per acre. The multiple is 368 times the original purchase price across 76 years. Owen had done this calculation himself, the same way Frank had done the tile drainage payback calculation on the back of an envelope in 1948. He had looked at both numbers. He had thought about what $2.24 million would do for his operation: equipment, operating capital, expansion opportunities. He had thought about what selling the wet quarter would mean for the farm's long-term production capacity. He had thought about Frank's purchase receipt in the farm file. He had called the investment fund and said, "The ground is not for sale." The fund representative had said, "I understand." He had paused. "I want to be sure you understand the offer is at market value." Owen had said, "I understand." The representative had said, "Is there a price at which it would be for sale?" Owen had thought about this. He had said, "No." He paused. "It is not a price question." The representative had asked what the question was. Owen had said, "The question is what the ground is for." He had paused. "My great-grandfather bought it to farm. My family has farmed it for 76 years. I intend to farm it for as long as I am able." He paused. "The investment fund intends to lease it to a tenant." He paused. "That is a different thing." He had hung up. He had put Frank's receipt back in the farm file. "Let me tell you about what the ground has produced in 76 years, because the land value appreciation is only part of the accounting and not the most important part." Frank had bought the wet quarter for $6,080 in 1948 and had spent approximately $1,400 on the tile drainage installation through 1953. Total investment, $7,480. From 1954, when the drainage was complete, through 2024, 70 years of productive farming, the wet quarter has been in continuous crop production. At an average yield of 150 bushels per acre per year across the full 70 years, accounting for the lower yields of the 1950s and 1960s and the higher yields of the 2000s and 2010s, the field has produced approximately 10,500 bushels per acre of corn equivalent over the 70-year production period. At an average corn price across that period of roughly $3 per bushel in $2,024 adjusted for the general price level, the 160-acre parcel has generated approximately $5 million in gross crop revenue over 70 years from a $7,480 investment. Frank did not know these numbers in 1948. He did not need to. He knew the soil was drummer silty clay loam, and he knew it could be drained, and he knew that drummer drained was among the most productive ground in Illinois. He knew the bank was evaluating the ground on its current wet performance rather than its potential drain performance. He knew he was buying potential, not current value. The bank was evaluating correctly by its own standards. The bank was not in the business of financing potential. The bank was in the business of lending against proven collateral. Wet ground was not proven collateral. Frank's judgment that the ground could be drained was exactly the kind of uncertain outcome the bank could not lend against. Frank was right, and Whitfield was right, simultaneously, which is the only way this story makes sense. The bank made the correct decision for a lending institution. Frank made the correct decision for a farmer with a long-time horizon and the knowledge to see what the ground could become. The bank is closed. The ground is at $14,000 per acre and still in the family. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the ground bought for cash when the bank would not lend against it. Of the men who read soil rather than reading appraisals. Of the 3 generations of one family that farmed the same 160 acres from $38 per acre to $14,000 per acre without ever selling an acre of it. Tell me in the comments, does your family have ground that was bought when nobody thought it was worth the price? What was the price then? What would it sell for today? Owen has the 1948 purchase receipt, $6,080, 160 acres, $38 per acre. He has put it in a frame. It hangs on the farmhouse wall beside a 2024 county soil survey map of the same 160 acres, showing soil capability class 1 on every acre, the highest productive rating in the USDA classification system. Frank did not see the class 1 map. He saw the drummer silty clay loam in the soil probe and the clay hardpan at 18 inches and the outlet ditch at the south field edge and the $38 price when the bank would not lend. And he made the decision from those 4 facts. He said once, "I am not buying what this ground is. I am buying what this ground can be." The ground became what Frank saw when he walked it twice in September of 1948. It has been what Frank saw ever since. The bank is closed. The ground is at $14,000 an acre. It is still in the family. It has never been for sale. That is what $38 looks like across 76 years when the right man reads the soil and the bank reads only the water. Let me tell you about what was happening on the adjacent farms in Iroquois County in the same years Frank was farming the wet quarter, because the comparison is what gives the ground story its full weight. The farms surrounding the Hetrick wet quarter in 1948 were farmed by men who had made similar calculations about their own ground. 2 of them had also been offered wet ground parcels in the late 1940s and had declined, not because of bad judgment, but because they were evaluating on current performance the way Whitfield had evaluated Frank's application. One had said, "I'll wait until the tile is in." The other had said, "Too wet for what they're asking." Frank had not waited. He had bought at $38 per acre when the ground was wet and made it what it could be. By 1965, when the wet quarter was producing 110 bushels per acre, the 2 neighbors who had declined similar wet parcels were farming their existing ground at 90 to 100 bushels per acre of corn. Fully drained, well managed, good ground, but not as good as what the wet parcels would have been. Properly drained, because wet prairie pothole drummer silty clay loam is specifically the highest performing soil in the county, precisely because of the thousands of years of organic matter accumulation in the waterlogged reducing conditions that also caused the drainage problem. The same conditions that made the ground wet made it extraordinarily fertile once the drainage problem was solved. Frank had not known this in any technical sense. He had known it from watching what drained drummer produced on adjacent parcels that had been tiled before his time. He had looked at the wet quarters drummer profile and seen the same soil that was producing 100 bushels per acre on the drained parcels around it, and had concluded that the wet quarter drained would do the same. He had been right. The wet quarter, fully drained, outperformed those adjacent parcels because the waterlogging had preserved and enhanced the organic matter content in the drummer profile beyond what the drained parcels had. He had paid $38 per acre for ground that, once drained, turned out to be better than the ground that had been drained and farmed continuously for 30 years. The bank had evaluated the current performance. Frank had evaluated the potential. The bank had been looking at the water. Frank had been looking at the soil under the water. Let me tell you about what Whitfield's appraisal actually said, because Frank had a copy of the loan denial letter in his farm file alongside the purchase receipt, and Owen has read it. As the denial letter from September 1948 reads, in the formal language of bank correspondence, as follows in substance. And Owen has read this letter more than once. The loan committee has reviewed your application for a purchase loan of $5,000 against the northwest quarter of Section 14. Based on the drainage history of the parcel and the inconsistent crop production record over the previous 10 years, the committee has determined that the collateral value of the property at the requested loan-to-value ratio cannot be supported at this time. The committee notes that the parcel's productive capacity is substantially dependent on drainage improvements, whose cost and effectiveness are not determinable at present. The committee is not in a position to approve a loan against projected rather than current collateral value. This is a careful and professionally sound piece of institutional reasoning. The bank was not wrong about the uncertainty. The drainage improvements were costly, and their effectiveness was genuinely uncertain in 1948, before Frank had done the soil assessment. The bank was not able to evaluate the soil the way Frank evaluated it. They had a real estate appraisal based on current agricultural productivity, not a farmer's reading of the subsurface soil profile. Owen has the denial letter and the purchase receipt in the same file. He has read both many times. He has said, the bank was doing its job. He has said, my great-grandfather was doing his. He has said, the job of the bank and the job of the farmer are not the same job, and the difference between them in that letter is the whole story. The bank evaluated risk on current information. Frank evaluated potential on future information he could read in the soil. Both were doing exactly what they should have been doing. The bank closed in 1987, having done its job correctly by banking standards. Frank's wet quarter is at $14,000 per acre in 2024, having done its job correctly by farming standards. Let me also tell you about the one conversation Don had with his son Ray in 1992 that passed the full weight of the story forward, because the words Don chose are the words that have stayed with the family. Ray had been 22 in 1992 when Don handed the farm over. Not in a formal ceremony, but gradually, the way farm transitions happen, with more and more of the decision-making and physical work shifting to Ray over a 3-year period. Don had stayed involved through 1995. In the spring of 1992, Don and Ray had been walking the wet quarter at planting time, checking the soil condition after a wet April. The ground had drained perfectly. The tile system Frank had installed 43 years earlier was still functioning, still carrying the spring water off the field, still delivering the wet quarter to planting condition on the same schedule as the fully drained adjacent ground. Don had stopped in the middle of the field. He had crouched and pushed his hand into the drummer topsoil the way Frank had pushed his hand into it in 1948. He had looked at Ray. He had said, "Your great-grandfather paid $38 an acre for this ground when the bank would not lend against it." Ray had said, "I know." Don had said, "He sold cattle to buy it." Ray had said, "I know that too." Don had said, "No." He had looked at the soil on his palm. "You know the facts." He paused. "I want you to know what it means." He paused. He sold cattle in December of 1948, not at the best price because December is not a good cattle sale month. He sold them at what the market was in December because that was when he needed the money. He paused. He took less on the cattle to buy this ground when the bank said it was not worth lending against. Ray had been quiet. He had said, "Why?" Don had said, "Because he looked at the soil and saw what it was going to be." He paused. The bank looked at the field and saw what it was. He looked at Ray. A bank sees what is. A farmer sees what can be. He paused. Remember that distinction every time you look at a piece of ground someone says is not worth the price. Ray had remembered. He had passed the farm to Owen in 2018. He had told Owen the same story with the same point, not in those exact words, because each generation rewords what they mean. The same point. A bank sees what is. A farmer sees what can be. Owen had put it in his own words when he declined the investment fund's offer. He had said, "The question is what the ground is for." He had meant the investment fund sees what the ground is worth per acre on the current market. I see what the ground is for across the next generation. It is the same distinction Frank made in 1948. It has not changed. The number has changed from $38 to $14,000. And the ground is better than Frank left it, and the bank is closed, and the family is still farming. The distinction is the same. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is what Frank said when the tile drainage was complete, and the first fully drained crop was off the wet quarter in the fall of 1954. Frank had walked the wet quarter after the 1954 harvest, in October, when the corn was off and the field was open. He had walked it the same way he had walked it twice in September of 1948, slowly, looking at the surface, checking the drainage outlets, reading the ground. He had his son Don with him, who was 14 in 1954 and had helped with the tiling for the past 5 years. He had stopped at the center of the field. He had looked at the 160 acres around him, drained, productive, no longer the wet quarter, except in memory. He had looked at Don. He had said, "This is what the ground was going to be." Don had said, "Yes." Frank had said, "The bank thought we were buying a wet field." He paused. We were buying the soil under the water. He had not said anything else about it. He had walked back to the farm truck. He had driven home. The soil under the water. That is what $38 an acre bought in 1948. The soil that the water was sitting on. The water is gone. The soil is still there. It is drummer, silty, clay loam, soil capability class 1, the state soil of Illinois. 76 years of continuous production from a 12-year tile drainage system installed by hand by a man who paid cash when the bank said no. The bank is closed. Owen farms the ground. It is not for sale. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories about what the ground is for, not what it is worth in the current market. About the men who rid soil when banks read appraisals. About the $38 per acre that becomes $14,000 per acre across 3 generations when the right person makes the right call in September of 1948, and every generation after keeps making the same call. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, does your family have ground that was bought when nobody believed in it? What was the price then, and what is it worth now? The receipt is framed. The soil survey is framed beside it. Frank said, I am not buying what this ground is. I am buying what this ground can be. The ground became what Frank saw. That is the whole story. Everything else is the number changing and the family staying the same. Let me tell you about what Ray had done with the wet quarter that Don had not done and that Frank had not imagined, because each generation of the Hetrick family has added something to what Frank started, and the additions matter to the full story. Don had expanded the tile system in 1974, adding 800 feet of lateral lines in the northwest corner that Frank's original herringbone had not fully covered. This had been the work of one summer, Don doing the installation himself, the way Frank had done the original system. The northwest corner, which had been the last section to dry out in wet springs under the original tile system, was fully drained by 1975. The yield map from 1975 forward showed the northwest corner coming up to the same performance as the rest of the field for the first time. Ray had added a systematic drainage water management system in 2004, controlled drainage boards at the main tile outlet that allowed him to hold water in the tile system during dry periods, using the field's own subsurface moisture to supplement in-season dry spells without irrigation. This was a 21st century application of the drainage system Frank had built in the 20th century, using the same tile infrastructure to do something Frank had not envisioned, not just drain excess water, but also conserve it. The yields from the wet quarter after 2004 showed a measurable improvement in drought years specifically because the controlled drainage was preserving subsurface moisture that the old unrestricted outlet would have drained away. Owen had added precision soil sampling in 2019, pulling 48 soil cores from the 160 acres and getting individual nutrient maps for each 2.5-acre zone. The maps had shown something interesting. The organic matter levels in the deep drummer topsoil were measurably higher in the lowest sections of the field, the areas that had been most waterlogged before Frank's tile drainage, than in the slightly higher and better naturally drained sections. The waterlogging that had made the ground unsaleable in 1948 had preserved additional organic matter in the most anaerobic zones. The sections the bank would have considered the most problematic had the highest organic matter, the highest cation exchange capacity, and the highest yield potential. Frank had seen this in the soil probe in 1948, without a laboratory to confirm it. He had simply seen dark soil, very dark, darker than the adjacent fields, darkening toward the lowest areas rather than lightening. He had known what very dark drummer silty clay loam meant. He had bought the darkest ground in the county when the bank called it the worst. Owen had looked at the 2019 soil sampling results and had understood for the first time with laboratory confirmation what Frank had seen with his eyes in 1948. He had called Ray to tell him what the maps showed. Ray had listened. Ray had said, "Your great-great-grandfather knew what he was looking at." Owen had said, "He saw what the bank could not see from a desk." Ray had said, "A bank never has a soil probe." That is the complete summary. The bank did not have a soil probe. Frank did. The bank saw uncertain ground at current value. Frank saw the darkest drummer in the county at future value. The bank said no. Frank paid cash. The bank closed. The dark soil is still producing. Let me also tell you about Owen's son, because the story does not end with Owen's refusal of the $14,000 offer. Owen's son is 8 years old. His name is Frank. Not named for the great-great-grandfather specifically. It was a family name that had been used in several generations. But Owen's son is Frank Hetrick II, named into a line that started with Frank Hetrick I in 1948. Owen has shown his son the two framed documents on the farmhouse wall, the 1948 purchase receipt and the 2024 soil survey map. He has explained what each document says as clearly as an 8-year-old can understand. He has taken the boy to the middle of the wet quarter, which is not called that anymore, has not been called that in Owen's lifetime, and has pushed a soil probe into the ground and shown the boy what drummer silty clay loam looks like in the core. He has told the boy what Frank I said, "I am not buying what this ground is. I am buying what this ground can be." The boy had looked at the soil probe core. He had said, "What can it be?" Owen had said, "Whatever we make of it." He had paused. The same thing your great-great-great-grandfather made of it when the bank said it was not worth lending against. The boy had looked at the field. He had said, "Did the bank go away?" Owen had said, "It closed in 1987. He had paused. "Your great-great-great-grandfather's ground is still here." The boy had nodded. He had looked at the dark drummer soil in the probe core. He had asked if he could hold it. Owen had given it to him. Young Frank Hetrick had turned the core sample over in his hands, looking at the dark soil the way an 8-year-old looks at something his father has told him is important. Then he had pressed it between his palms and felt the texture of it. The silty clay loam structure, the organic matter richness, the moisture-holding capacity built over thousands of years of prairie and waterlogging that the bank had called uncertain in 1948, and that a farmland investment fund had offered $14,000 per acre for in 2024. Owen had watched his son hold the soil. He had thought about Frank I pulling a soil probe at 8 locations across this same 160 acres in September of 1948, and looking at the same dark drummer in the core and seeing what it could be. He had thought about the bank closing. He had thought about the ground still being here. He had said nothing. He had let the boy hold the soil as long as he wanted. Young Frank had put the core back in the ground and brushed his hands on his jeans. Owen had said, "We'll go home." They had walked back to the truck together across the wet quarter that has not been wet since 1954 and has been the best ground on the farm since 1965 and is currently worth 368 times what the first Frank paid for it in cash when the bank said it was not worth the loan. The ground is not for sale. It will not be for sale when young Frank farms it. It was bought to be farmed. It has been farmed. It will be farmed. That is what $38 an acre buys when the right man reads the soil.